I'd just like to introduce the panels very, very quickly in order. Chris Boyer is 1997 Chicago PhD, professor at University of Illinois at Chicago, and his research trajectory has moved from campesino identity and agrarianism in Michoacan to the study of forestry and environmental history in Mexico. Jeremy Basks is a 1993 PhD, and so I think the senior member of this panel, professor at Ohio Wesleyan, and his work on cochineal in the late 18th, early 19th century in Oaxaca has just now been followed by a book, and I guess it's also going to be the title of your paper, on risk in Atlantic trade in the same period. Richard Turitz is not really the person sitting before you. This is his avatar, Aldo. And Aldo is going to channel Richard Turitz's paper. But Richard is a 1997 PhD who has worked on peasantry in the Dominican Republic. Pablo Silva, the 2000 PhD, is professor at Grinnell, and his work is on class, especially the Chilean middle class and its political radicalization. So let's begin.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming here. I'm sort of, it never ceases to be some surprise that people would want to hear this, but thank you all for coming. And the title of my book is The Ineluctability of Chihuahuan Railroads. It's a slight allusion to James Joyce's Ulysses, if anybody's interested in that question. It's a story about the difficulty of knowing where the scholarly track that one follows will lead, and of the generational ties that one recognizes along the way. It is a discussion of why I came to a place I had chosen not to, and how I came to more fully appreciate the functioning and unexpected mechanisms that lie behind the formation of scholarly generations. My entering class of graduate students was the 100th at the University of Chicago, and included nearly a dozen aspiring historians of Latin America. This was testimony not only to the program's capacity to attract students, but to the nearly masochistic work ethic of John Coatsworth and Friedrich Katz. Friedrich, however, had a fellowship in the 1997-98 academic year, leaving it to John to shepherd the flock. This is a true story. In testimony to John's sense of dedication, he decided to split the research seminar into two groups that year, and I believe he did not get any teaching credit for doing so. One was dedicated to social history and another to economic history. I knew where I fit. I would study social history. Although I knew that I wanted to benefit from John's scholarship, I could not imagine a time when I would share his core interest in economic history, much less the history of railroads, much less during the 19th century, much less during the Porfiriato. John, having earned a sabbatical and some respite from such teaching duties, left the continent. He decided to spend the following year at the Titala Institute. It now came time for my classmates to study with Friedrich, whose research seminar I took the following year. At some point that semester, I learned the old saw that his students were subject to nearly universally throughout academia. When you would be at a conference and someone would come up to you and say, you study with Friedrich Katz, what region of Chihuahua are you going to study? But I had already concluded that I would study not the border, but rather central Mexico, a place that I already knew and wished to learn more about. The North seemed too distant from the main stories of national history, too overtly engaged in a poisonous on-again, off-again relationship with the United States. For me, I decided it would be the sanctity of Michoacan during the 1920s and 1930s, a safe remove from the border and from the Porfiriato. Imagine my surprise then when a couple of years ago I found myself in the Spectral Collections Department of the University of Texas at El Paso, investigating the archives of the Northwestern Railroad Company, a U.S.-Canadian concern that, as the name suggests, was not only a railroad, but one whose line threaded through the eastern foothills of the Sierra Tarahumara in Chihuahua in the waning years of the Porfiriato. So much for foresight. Nonetheless, what took me to UTEP was not the sorts of environmental, or not the sorts of economic and borderlands history that had interested Friedrich and John, but rather it was a question of of the environment. But I came to learn that the environment actually was intimately related with questions of development and of the border. In fact, I found myself looking at things with a Coatsworthian eye towards modernization and its impact on rural people, and a Katzian appreciation for the relationship between North America and the people of Chihuahua. My interest in some way combined my work in some ways tried to combine the interests of both. I wished to see how the railroad influenced the forests environment of the Sierra Tarahumara, and through that the region's social history. And I was especially interested in how it influenced the Raramuri people, also known as the Tarahumara, who lived in dispersed rancherias in south-central Chihuahua. In other words, I hope to understand how this particular instance of development transformed the social and natural landscape of the Sierras, a project that in some ways brought a Katzworthian approach to the history of political ecology in northern Mexico. It turns out that the railroad represented a watershed moment in the area's social and environmental history. The Northwestern was a branch that departed from the National Railway and was built initially by two different groups of investors who intended to supply wood to the booming complex of mines and railroads that ran throughout the area. The railroads needed ties, of course, but they also needed wood to build trestles. And moreover, before Coahuilan coal became available in northern Mexico, almost all Mexican rolling stock used wood to travel with. This actually went on until well into the 20th century. The Porphyrian extraction economy also commodified the woods in several regions of Mexico, including Mexico State, Michoacan, Puebla, and Chihuahua. Many of these woodlands were regions of refuge, in Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran's words, where native people enjoyed relative security and land tenure because few outsiders had design on their property. The arrival of steam engines, steel saws, and long-term rental agreements with logging companies sparked unrest in several areas. In Michoacan, for example, Puré people in Cheran, which some of you may know is currently embroiled once again in a fight over its forests these days, currently against narcoforestales. In Cheran, people composed traditional songs known as pirecuas, lamenting the unpaid destruction of their woods, and they managed to kill North American logging experts who ventured into their land. In Chihuahua, however, most native people along rail lines chose to bide their time. In fact, many young men near the town of Madera, aptly named, began to fell trees and to hew railroad ties by hand because they learned that it could undercut the price of the logs that were sawed in the huge Pearson-owned modern steam-powered sawmill just down the road. In other words, they were able to undercut the industrial logs with the handmade kind. Individuals in some Raramuri rancherias continued to specialize in the elaboration of railroad ties for the ensuing 6 decades, despite the efforts of foresters to stamp out what they considered a waste of resources. To me, the tentative engagement of some Raramuri people with the outside market, even as others disapproved of this particular use of the woods and lambasted natives and non-natives alike for misusing communal and ejido lands, says quite a lot about the suppleness of native people's responses to the changes in the land, to borrow a phrase. It complicates simplistic readings of native responses to commodification, or capitalist exploitation, if you want, of what had now become not just woodscapes, but also storehouses of natural resources. Of stories like this, there are many, and I hope to illustrate some of them in my forthcoming book, which thankfully, after 10 years of work, is now in its final descent for landing, and will be published next year by Duke University Press. Like many of us in this room, I was trained to attend to the unexpected, like native people who embrace, even if tentatively, the commodification of forests as a way of complicating history and undermining tired assumptions. In the case of the Raramuri, who contributed even in a slight way to the commodification of their own forests, it would be an exaggeration to speak in Conclinian terms of entering and leaving modernity. It would instead be more appropriate to reprise Friedrich's discussions of what it means when Mexico's northern frontier became an economic and in this case, ethnic border. If there's merit in socially focused environmental history of this sort, it can be traced back in no small part to John and Friedrich, both of whom have emphasized the need to link the local and the interpersonal with the large and the structural. In a sense, I'm inspired by my training here to green Marx's dictum and argue that people make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it in a landscape chosen by themselves, but in an environment given and transmitted from the past. Since I have become an environmental historian and am therefore sometimes given to the pessimistic and declensionist readings of human interaction with nature that seems to characterize my new gremio, I am tempted to round out that quotation by suggesting that the traditions of the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the ecology of the living. But to do so would not only be to overextend the metaphor, but to assume that there is one pathway from the past to the present. I prefer to think of the way that the environment helps to structure human behavior more like a railway with many branches. Although we might know where the tracks lead, we never really know where they will take us, even if that means places we never thought we would traverse, like Chihuahua during the Porfiriato, the historiographic homeland of the Katzworth years.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Jeremy, you have your microphone.
I do. I don't know if it's on.
The title of Jeremy Basque's presentation is Risky Business, Trade and Uncertainty in the Spanish Atlantic World of the 18th Century.
First, I want to say thank you for coming, and I'm not surprised you came out on a Saturday. This is exciting. And I think we should thank Chuck and the other people, the professors here who put this together, and especially congratulate the Katz and Coatsworth folks here. I'm going to talk about a new project that is landing as well very soon. And but before I want to tell you the original origins of it, it really began about 10 years ago or so in an email that I sent to John, perhaps in the middle of the night, with this what seemed like a simple question. It's simple for him to answer. I didn't know the answers. That's why I sent it to him. But in any event, he sent back an email saying that you've got a great idea here. This is something you should run with. This is a good idea for your next project. And so I've spent the last 10 years responding to this. I guess the moral is, and I don't know if anyone else has ever made this connection, if somebody sends you advice and they share their initials with Jesus H. Christ, then you ought to listen to it closely and follow it with. So I did, and so I did. Anyone else ever noticed that? The focus of my work now is on transatlantic trade, and specifically focusing on risk and the centrality of risk in international trade. Something that, if you read the historiography, the colonial historiography, because this is the 18th century, is almost never addressed. By looking at the transatlantic trade through the prism of risk, it, I think, entirely changes the interpretation of how the commercial system, the colonial Spanish commercial system, worked. Economists really distinguish between risk and uncertainty. Risk is something that can be measured, and thus you can buy insurance to get rid of it. Uncertainty is really what I'm focusing on today. And uncertainty are things that really are out of the control. They're the things that make commerce so dangerous and complicated. It's the thing that really, I think, more than anything, shaped the behaviors of merchants during the colonial period. Most important was the uncertainty of what we might call commercial risks. Obviously, we all know it's really simple to be a merchant. You just buy low and sell high. The problem is there's a great deal of risk that doesn't happen, that you buy where you think is low, but you can't sell it. In any event, these commercial risks were simply enormous, and yet they seem to be lost in the historiography, which sort of presents this trade as being, well, a much more guaranteed and much more profitable venture than I know it to be. It's uncertainty which created this. There were ways to address uncertainty, and that was through obtaining information. We We all know how trade or anything, even when we want to buy a new appliance, we want all the information we can. The problem is the difference is we have incredible access to information in the 18th century and before. Merchants had poor access to information. The information they obtained was scarce, it was old, it was difficult to obtain. Merchants spent almost all of their time writing letters to people throughout the world. The merchants that I'm focused on really are all in Cádiz. I'm sort of a Spanish historian at this point. But, and they wrote copious letters to people all throughout the Atlantic, in Latin America, in the northern European ports, constantly writing letters. This was how they had their information. They sought information certainly about commercial, what was desirable at any given moment, tastes, etc., but also about political issues. They had to, as best they could, know what was happening politically throughout the Atlantic world. All of these things contributed to these incredible uncertainties that could truly destroy merchants. I was fortunate enough to obtain the correspondence of a handful of merchants, and you get the sense of how much they correspond, how frequently they correspond. For example, one merchant in Cádiz, Francisco de Sierra, literally received tens of thousands of letters over the course of his merchant career. He was a member of the Consulado of Cádiz, etc. Just to give an example, in 1781 and 1784, I choose those because there's one war year and one peace year, he received some 1,225 letters from literally dozens of ports, both in America and throughout the European era. This was where he traded. He obtained colonial goods and traded them in the north, obtained European goods and sent them back to America. Again, these letters dealt with myriad issues, but primarily commercial and political issues. One of the things that made this particular merchant useful to me was that he was incredibly religious about keeping track of when he received his letters. So one thing I've been able to do is find out how long it took for information to flow across the Atlantic or through. Most important, across the Atlantic, it was very time-consuming to send letters. Just to give you an example, the average letter from Lima took 197 days to reach Cádiz. So that's 6 months. If I'm a merchant, I'm trying to plan my business, and the news I have about what's really hot in Lima is 6 months old. By the time I can turn around and buy some stuff and send it off there, and it'll take 6 months to get there because that's what it takes to travel roughly on average. We're talking about a year and a half turnover. Who knows if there's any validity to the news I had originally? This uncertainty is monumental. Without some way to understand or control this information, merchants would be extremely vulnerable. I have all these pictures here because I thought there would be you're enjoying the pictures maybe. I thought there would be a PowerPoint. Guy flipping a coin, it was almost like gambling. And I think that many merchants saw it as gambling, but you had to do whatever you could to improve your odds, if you like. The letters that the merchants received, again, dealt with all sorts of commercial and political issues. A letter from Diego Sáenz de Tejada from Lima in 1782 told Francisco de Sierra, for example, cacao is running at 7.5 to 8 pesos per load, an exorbitant price given the existing war. Paper and knives are very abundant, but shirts will give you a very good return. With the current price on these items, you can be very well compensated if you choose to take this risk. News obtained sometime, 6 months after April 1782, roughly. He also communicated with merchants in the north, such as Echenique Sanchez, who was a merchant, ran a merchant house in Amsterdam, who wrote, "Rumors of the war's end have not caused even the slightest alteration in the market for our American commodities, etc., etc. Sugar has demonstrated some significant decline recently, but as they write from the French ports, as peace solidifies, the price of this item will regularize, and the same will occur here. Information was slow. And so the information which guided merchant behavior which was so central to merchant behavior, was often useless. It often could be even destructive. One of the best, I think, things somebody said, you always want them to say the right thing. The same merchant in Lima, Antonio Sáenz de Tejada, wrote in 1784 with enormous frustration to Francisco de Sierra, "Shipments from Spain always seem to be imperfect," he lamented, "even if informed of the shortages by the latest arriving news, because from what I have seen in the present, nothing is more excessive than the item that was previously in short supply, because everyone's asking for it." So all of these merchants wrote home to their principals saying, send this, send that. It all came at once with great peril. The source or the greatest fear or danger of the commercial risk, the uncertainty, was that markets would be grossly oversupplied. Buy low, sell high. Problem is, if everybody arrived with enormous quantities of a single item, the prices would plummet, fortunes could be lost. They feared oversupplied markets. Douglas North, the Nobel laureate economist, writes something to the effect of that institutions are critical in shaping economic behavior, and that institutions, well structured, can help make possible trade or any type of business activity, transaction that would otherwise be too dangerous or too risky. To reduce the uncertainty and unpredictability of this transatlantic trade, I argue, the Spanish merchants and their Mexican counterparts used the fleet system, the famous fleet system, which I kind of began talking about, and what we call regulated trade, which before 1778 entailed sort of biannual shipments in fleets or very restricted permission to ship things abroad. The traditional depiction of this fleet system, as we all know, is one in which merchants earned monopoly profits, extraordinary profits, taking advantage of their, participation in this somewhat restricted system. My thesis, I don't think that's right. My thesis instead is that regulated trade in the fleet system in the Spanish Empire served to reduce uncertainty and facilitate commerce under conditions of poor information, to balance supply with demand, to prevent financial catastrophe. So the fleet system, I'm arguing, reduced uncertainty caused by poor information, the slow movement of goods, inflexible ability of merchants to quickly change what they've supplied. Again, it could take years to ship something to America. By limiting supplies, by limiting trade to what was believed could be consumed, the attempt was to balance supply and demand to create a more regularized and predictable flow of commodities. That is, to reduce the risk of grossly oversupplied markets. Well, this worked, I think, until, it was dismantled. In 1778, as part of the Bourbon reforms, the Spanish crown dismantled the system of trade. 3 minutes? Okay. Dismantled the system of trade, terminating the flota to New Spain and expanding massively the number of registered ships sailing to, Peru and Argentina, etc. All of this led, in fact, to an an oversupply of markets. I say not incredible because if you read the literature, textbooks are all wrong. They say that trade increased by 4 to 10 times, which is simply wrong. Spanish historians have demonstrated this is wrong. But in any event, it definitely increased supply, inundating markets, oversupplying markets, and causing a terrible economic catastrophe. Comercio Libre then dismantled an institution that had served to reduce uncertainty, resulting in the increased unpredictability of transatlantic trade. Indeed, this is what merchants complained of. Merchants after this said, "A merchant does not have a firm idea of how to cast his lines due to the freedom that open commerce allows. one Mexico City Consulado member said. American markets are superabundantly provisioned, and lately one cannot engage in any transatlantic business without danger of being ruined, as has occurred to many, a Cadiz Consulado member said. Yeah, this is extra. Another one said, Antonio Basoco of Mexico, experienced merchants have divested so as not to risk losing in several years what they have acquired over the cost of many. The Crown caught on to this and began being alarmed about the enormous number of bankruptcies. In Cadiz, dozens and dozens of bankruptcies began happening after 1778, really after 1783, after the American Revolution. Never before has there been such repeated bankruptcies as in the present time, nor complicated litigations, the Cadiz Consulado said to the king. I misspoke there. Bankruptcies have introduced confusion in this commerce and a general distrust among the individuals in the houses of commerce, which are perceived in total discredit in Spain and foreign kingdoms. Indeed, when one looks at the number of bankruptcies between June of 87 and February of 91, there were an average of 3.5 bankruptcies per month in front of the Cadiz Consulado, a significant rise over the previous era. Between 1760 and 1769, there were 34 bankruptcies in front of the Council of Indies. Between 1780 and 1789, there were 64. It peaked with 24 bankruptcies going in front of the Council of Indies in 1791, just before the French Revolution. In short, Comercio Libre created this free-for-all and led to the significant rise, growing uncertainty, growing bankruptcy, and, well, growing unpredictability. I'm right here done. So my conclusion is that risk and uncertainty were predominant factors in early modern Atlantic commerce, and to fully understand mercantile behavior, one must look at risk and think about the role that risk played. Indeed, you can't really understand pre-modern economic activity without thinking about things like risk. It's a different world, and people behaved in different ways, oftentimes as creating institutions to change or lessen the uncertainty. I kind of went over and didn't have any final chance to say, but that's it.
Now, once again, Aldo Lariosante very kindly agreed to read the paper of Richard Turretts, who, for overwhelming reasons at the last minute, found that he couldn't come today.
Hello. Historical puzzles and unsettling perspectives, seeking a Katzworthy methodology in the history of race and slavery in Santo Domingo. And don't shoot the messenger, okay? I'm just reading this thing, whatever. Even though I chose to study the Dominican Republic, not Mexico or Central America, I nonetheless have followed closely in the footsteps of my advisors, John Coatsworth and Friedrich Katz. In my own work, I have examined both rural society and foreign relations and empire. Both of these subjects became important to me through the bright light shine on them in John and Friedrich's own work and teaching. But perhaps even more than in precise subject matter, it had been their approach to exploring history that had influenced me. Their work questions accepted wisdom rather than following existing historiography. Their work integrates the analytical and the narrative, the study and the story. By situating subjects in broad world historical and comparative scope, their work and their teaching challenges unknowing presumptions, and this approach encourages new and unexpected vantage points from which to write history. For me, this approach means finding the questions that are begged by existing historiographies. Both John and Friedrich drew my attention to the paradoxes, contradictions, and historical puzzles that once identified seemed like they should have been obvious, but which have been instead obscured by easy assumptions, making false sense of things that are in fact difficult to understand. It was they who encouraged me to question the assumptions that a dictator can rule a nation for decades through repression alone and with no social base, that's Trujillo, or that racism is itself a sufficient explanation for understanding the performance of mass violence, as opposed to racism also having to be explained historically. Challenging these two common presumptions guided my early work on the Trujillo regime and the Haitian massacre. Through John's and Friedrich's influence, I learned the value of moving Socratically from an ignorant sense of our own knowledge to a knowledgeable sense of our own ignorance, with ignorance becoming an at least a temporary endpoint of new knowledge. Friedrich structured much of his teaching around deconstructing terms and posing illuminating questions. What is a revolution, he asked. When does state violence mobilize rather than immobilize or demobilize resistance? How does being a part of political violence, either as victim or insurgent, transform one as a political subject? Or why, if Fidel Castro surely would have won an election in the early years of his rule, did he not hold elections and thereby secure international legitimacy? And if there had been almost no way for the Bay of Pigs operation to succeed, something that later CIA documents revealed its officials had recognized prior to the attack, why then did the CIA go ahead with it? And finally, as some of us were asked at our preliminary oral exams, why did many Spanish-American colonies not become one country? In fact, let's discuss that now. As did the 13 North American British colonies that became the United States. If Friedrich Katz's example encouraged me to pose new questions, John Coatsworth showed me how to offer hypotheses to answer them. John modeled the value of intellectual courage in many senses. Never run from contrary evidence, he emphasized, but rather embrace it head on, even take it further and practice a practice that could lead to finding the unrecognized historical puzzles that Friedrich and he treasured. Don't be afraid to use imagination to interpret sources, and always state clearly the limitations of your claims. Finally, John encouraged me, as did Friedrich, not to fear moving beyond my bailiwick, that of 20th century Latin Americanist, in both time and space, in order to allow deep contextualization and broad comparative perspectives to inform hypotheses and provide compelling narratives. To sketch some of where all of this has led me of late in my current monograph, I would like to offer a few examples of the evidence with which I am now working, evidence that has remained largely outside the historiography of Latin America and Atlantic history. This evidence concerns the history of race and slavery in colonial Santo Domingo, dating back to the little-known sugar plantation society of the 1500s. And this evidence leads to new questions and hypotheses that reflect, I think, John and Friedrich's influence and example. For instance, in court records held at the Archivo General in Spain, I found the case of Rodrigo Lopez, a putative slave of black color, who in 1532 was purchased by a prominent sugar planter in Santo Domingo. At that time he was purchased, Lopez was already suing for his freedom. Lopez claimed that he had been freed in the will of a previous owner when he lived in Portuguese Cape Verde, off the coast of West Africa. He explained in court that he had been wrongfully re-enslaved by the nephew of his former owner after the owner's death and sold to a slave trader from Cubagua, an island today part of Venezuela. Cubagua was in a key port in the still little known but in fact bustling slave trade of both enslaved Indians and Africans that united Africa, the Caribbean, and multiple parts of the Americas. After a series of sales, Lopez ended up in Santo Domingo, which was the main endpoint for this trade. Ultimately, Lopez won his case in the High Court, and he did so thanks to his sister, who had been freed at the same time, and remarkably, she had learned from sailors crisscrossing the Atlantic of her brother's re-enslavement in Santo Domingo. She secured documents from a local Portuguese judge in Cape Verde that reproduced the sections of their deceased owner's will, granting them freedom upon his death. Then again, relying on the collaboration of sailors, his sisters managed to send these documents across the Atlantic to Lopez. Based on this evidence, he won his case, notwithstanding the prominence of his would-be owner, a former member of the Audiencia and accountant at the time in the Royal Treasury. It is well known that Santo Domingo was the earliest site of European colonization and conquest in the Americas. Yet Santo Domingo's role as a new world's first plantation economy based on sugar production and the labor of tens of thousands of enslaved Africans has largely been ignored. But cases such as Lopez begins to give us a sense of this history. Lopez's story places Santo Domingo at the center of an Atlantic world already by the early 16th century, united by the globalizing forces of the Atlantic slave trade. As people, capital, information, and documents crisscrossed the Atlantic and traveled around the Caribbean Sea. We also see the dynamism of and high demand for that trade, as Lopez was in fact purchased 6 times in the 7 years after he was freed by his owner. Indeed, the last purchase occurring even as he was in court suing for his freedom. Finally, Lopez's case reveals enslaved and formerly enslaved people successfully making use of multiple state authorities on both sides of the ocean in pursuit of their rights. It is common to dismiss Santo Domingo's early plantation society, the presumption being that Spaniards moved on to more lucrative Peru and Mexico as soon as they could, leaving only indigenous decimation and a commercial desert in their wake. If we accept this, though, we miss the opportunity to learn from and analyze the legacy of this first plantation society in the Americas, one that lasted about 75 years. This lifespan is close to that of most of the subsequent thriving plantation lands in the Americas that had immense portions of their population enslaved. Part of that legacy is the increasing power and centrality of modern categories of race and racism in colonial law and discourse, which expanded with both the enslavement of tens of thousands of people of African descent and the novel isolation of slavery to a single group defined by racial terms. Another part of that legacy, though, stems from the way this plantation society collapsed beginning at the end of the 16th century. In its wake sprung up something unique in the African diaspora and the Americas. The evidence suggests that most of the formerly enslaved population escaped to freedom across the island, and the colony became then a land composed predominantly of independent peasants of African and mixed African and European descent. Further evidence I'm working with suggests that this population subsisted mostly on open lands in the colony's immense untamed woodlands, Los Montes. For centuries, enjoy material conditions of relative autonomy at odds with the racist hierarchy of metropolitan laws and discourse. Santo Domingo thus represents an intriguing and understudied trajectory within the range of African diasporic experiences. A colonial society formed mostly by free persons of African descent, while lacking a wealthy and powerful white elite long before the formal abolition of slavery. And this trajectory helps explain in new ways, I believe, the evolution of certain important, now almost infamous features of 20th century Dominican society that have puzzled outside observers for decades. Namely, that among a mostly African-descended population, being of African descent has not been the basis of any enduring collective black identity. My attempt to explain this brings me to a second set of historical data that, when certain questions are asked of it, can reveal new and unexpected histories of race in the Dominican Republic and the Americas more generally. Santo Domingo's commercial decline has been labeled by many Dominican historians a century of misery, a period of historical regression from Santo Domingo's putative splendor in the 1500s, when it was the vanguard of expanding global capital. The end of the plantation economy was, though, a boon for the vast majority of the population who were enslaved. Economic decline and underdevelopment of land and commerce opened up new opportunities for slaves to be granted purchase or, above all, the data suggests, escape to their freedom. Santo Domingo's relatively vast and populated landscape, teeming wildlife, rugged terrain, and minimal infrastructure provided optimal conditions for slaves to escape to freedom and to secure their own subsistence. Fugitive slaves also appeared to have been accepted by rural denizens in these areas with relative ease. Mixing with marginal rural colonists of European descent, they constituted an exceptional and enduring Afro-Caribbean peasantry more than a century before the formal abolition of slavery, when Santo Domingo came under Haitian rule, 1822. Thus, the slave population would decrease from over 3/4 of the total population in the 16th century to roughly 15% of the colony a century later, a percentage that had fairly steady until abolition. A 1681 census indicates that 3/4 of all persons of African descent were free, and those free people of color composed the largest part of the colony. Indications that Santo Domingo's peasantry was reconstituted largely by escaped slaves and their descendants appears in some of the few records we have from the countryside in the colonial period, parish registers from rural towns for which these records remain. In these registers, about half of the free population, how am I doing with time? 3 minutes? Okay. He wrote a lot. I tried to cut this and I can't cut it. He wrote it, I can't cut it. Let's see if I can skip a little bit ahead. These are the naming practices. Although there is no way to know with certainty if we bring to these sources the kind of imagination that John once told me was necessary when moving into more barren archival past, we can speculate that these naming practices reflected a large presence of fugitive slaves and their descendants who had a vital need to remain hidden from authorities. And even some of those who were legally manumitted may have chosen to break thus with their slave past by not taking the family name of a former owner. These naming practices are certainly in stark contrast with the patterns of most Spanish as well as British America. This peasantry, founded largely by fugitive slaves, existed in a broader colonial context in which official racism and racial categories persisted in law and ideology, and racial slavery prevailed legally until 1822. But the significance of race is, as it evolved under conditions of freedom in Los Montes, remains far from clear. The peasantry's distance from metropolitan institutions, the minimal white presence in rural areas, and the low degree of economic segmentation appear to have reduced the efficacy of legal racism and racial categories in everyday life among the popular rural classes. On the one hand, the peasantry emerged out of the wreckage of plantation slavery and remained inevitably affected by racist practices, laws, and discourses in the colony. On the other hand, independent peasants of color appear to have succeeded in living lives at odds with and largely removed from elite versions of a society of free whites and coerced and subordinated black laborers. Direct evidence of the meaning of race in rural Santo Domingo is hard to find. One glimpse into this are, again, parish registers, although these registers were compiled by and thus reflect the perspective of church officials, rather than peasants living in Los Montes. They nonetheless document a space in which metropolitan colonial ideologies came in closest proximity to the realities of the countryside. Then he analyzes the parish registers. I'm going to skip that and try to give you a sense of the last two paragraphs. This refusal to implement Spanish-American policy in the preceding section about counting people and naming them, and how there's no race identification going on, which is quite amazing. Anyway, this refusal to implement long-standing Spanish-American policy suggests how the significance of the metropole's hierarchical line between those entirely of European descent and those of any African descent had decreased over time in colonial Santo Domingo, and that race had become, in certain context at least, a problematic basis for collective identity and for signifying other social cleavages, even in the capital. Had social difference and power relations been starkly mapped onto, that is, readable from broad racial categories, separate imagined communities based on African versus European descent would doubtless have congealed, marking individuals racially and making identification seem more transparent and less tenuous to church officials. This is not to say that being of African descent was not subject to racist stigma in multiple ways, as it certainly was. Yet it appears nonetheless not to have been the basis of a distinct community or social world among the free. The absence of a collective black identity in the Dominican Republic today has often been used as evidence of a supposed denial of African descent, and thus of an objective truth among Dominicans, one that is supposedly explained by their deep transhistorical racism, and especially against those who are Haitian or of Haitian descent. I have learned from John and Friedrich, though, to question such easy analysis, ones that seem to ignore mountains of contrary historical evidence. The still obscure and unexpected history of race and slavery in Santo Domingo instead offers us a way to study how racial categories gain, or in this case lose, meaning as the basis of collective identity, depending on the degree to which they do or do not embody other social significant divisions, the degree to which they became and remain associated with other forms of inequality. And it is a case that thereby illustrates the processes of racialization and racial transformation that have been at work, though perhaps less starkly, throughout the history of the Americas. Rather than assuming that Dominicans, most of whom are of African descent, should have made their African descent central to their identity, I have tried to ask what their history instead reveals about the evolution of race and racism in general. My life is full right now of such revisionist questions and explorations, and for that I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to John and Friedrich.
Thank you, Aldo. And now Pablo Silva will speak on more political economy than historical materialism, institutions and class relations in 20th century Chile.
In 1992, other Latin American history programs focused attention on the quincentenary of Columbus's first voyage to America. But in Hyde Park, the highlight that year was, for me, the night that many of us gathered in my apartment on South Cornell to watch the inaugural episode of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. I'm talking, of course, about the pilot episode where Indiana Jones meets up with Pancho Villa. Friedrich had been a consultant on the production, so many of us were curious to see what Hollywood was going to do with this interpretation of Villa. I can't remember precisely who was there that night. I assume Gary Gordon and Mike Werner were there, Chris Boyer maybe, Matt Karish, Eric, were you? But Ben Falah was definitely there. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Peter. Ben Falah was definitely there. There was a moment in the show when Indiana asked Villa why Mexicans were fighting, and Villa squatted down on the ground and grabbed a handful of earth and said something like, "This is what we are fighting for." At that moment, Ben yelled out, "Take that, Alan Knight." This is the only other crowd where that joke works, by the way. The joke got a big laugh because we all had a sense of what it meant. For us, we all saw Friedrich and Knight as offering somewhat different positions on the revolution. In particular, Knight sought to challenge Marxist models of revolution that were focused on defining the revolution as bourgeois, abortive, proto-socialist, or in some other terms. Friedrich did not seem especially interested in entering that debate. I think many of us in the room that night had read Knight's Pretty Pink books as a somewhat dizzying parade of one Mexican politico after another, and thus saw him privileging politics ahead of the material base. So when we saw dirt slipping out of Villa's hands on TV, we thought Friedrich was righting the balance a bit between the political and the material. Talking to Ben about it recently, he recalls Peter Guardino saying something to the effect, "We were all generic Marxists then," which I took to mean that we thought economic structures were really important. How exactly wasn't clear. We assumed class conflict played an important role in historical processes, and these social and economic relations were somehow connected to competing political visions present in every society. For me personally, this general outlook shaped my interest in Chilean class politics. My research agenda would not have made any sense had I begun with the assumption that politics was somehow completely autonomous of class relations. But the joke was funny also because we knew that Friedrich himself would never have said anything like that. First of all, it wasn't his style. Second, Friedrich was also clearly a huge admirer of Knight. From where I sat as a non-Mexicanist, I think I saw more similarities than differences in their approaches. In terms of the big argument Friedrich really seemed to care about, he and Knight were clearly on the same side. Both Friedrich and Knight thought that Mexico had experienced a revolution and not a great rebellion. In terms of actors, Friedrich had his colonos, and Knight had his serranos, and both saw these popular sectors motivated by economic concerns. And while I never heard Friedrich use terms like homologous categories and the like, he was clearly intrigued by Knight's observation that there was no, quote, clear congruence between political factions and class interests during the revolution, unquote. When he commented on my research, Friedrich repeatedly pointed out that the Chilean middle class seemed not to behave according to orthodox expectations. Friedrich kept that orthodox Marxist vision of class behavior top of mind, but he seemed to be interested in the anomalies created by empirical reality, the places where actual history did not quite match Marxist theory. In John's case, I think it is fair to say that he was and remains very interested in structure. But I think it would also be fair to say that he was even less constrained by orthodoxy, any orthodoxy, than Friedrich. I have some notes I took down after a meeting in Cambridge where I scribbled his questions about my work. Where's the economic history? He complained. There's nothing here about labor force composition, the rentier system, structural stuff. That should all be here. He also noted that Chile was very hard by the hit very hard by the world economic downturns in 1919 and 1930. Shouldn't you mention that? But again, while John took it as a given that there was some sort of relationship between class relations and the economic base, he was pretty far from the assumption that there was some sort of clear correspondence between base and superstructure. In this sense, he was pretty far from the dominant line in the Chilean historiography that I was wrestling with at the time and that I continue to wrestle with. As he put it when I was first writing my proposal, what needs to be explained is why Chile has some of the most hostile class relations in Latin America. Like Friedrich, John did not imagine that a Marxist dialectic would explain away the particularities of the case, and John's own work put a lot of stress on the importance of institutions. When I think about it now, I see that both John and Friedrich, in their different ways, wanted me to pay attention to the broader political economy of the period in order to better understand the context of Chilean class relations. Looking back, I sure wish I had listened a little more closely at the time. Friedrich was always very supportive of my project looking at white-collar unions in Chile. He thought it would contribute to our understanding of the strength of the Chilean left, but he was clearly troubled by the fact that Chileans had come to focus on white-collar workers as middle class while excluding sectors that represented the core middle-class elements elsewhere in Latin America. He wanted an explanation of this anomaly. He also wanted to know more about the relationship between my union folk, as he put it, and the men with guns and money. This question paralleled John's point that I needed to understand the relationship between the white-collar workers to the rentier system. Looking back, I see now that my dissertation project, I gave far too much autonomy to the class actors I was interested in. I was too easily convinced by my source base of union newspapers and propaganda. They gave me a fairly straightforward narrative of how the class struggle was shaping Chilean politics in the middle of the 20th century. It has taken me a long time to come back to the basic questions of political economy for the Chilean case. But I now realize both John and Friedrich were right. Class politics in 20th century Chile, especially the politics of the middle class, was shaped by the rentier system and the men with the guns and the men with the money a lot more than I thought at the time. Let me start by talking about what I discovered about the rentier system, or what I think John meant when he said that. I understood that system to be the method by which the Chilean state divided up export earnings up through the crash of the nitrate economy in the 1920s and 1930s. The investigation of this topic has taken me back further into the past than my original research, and I've come to understand that the 1890s was really the foundational moment for class politics in Chile. It was in these years when two parties, the conservatives and the liberal Democrats, parties that historians would later categorize as right-wing, became the first mainstream political parties to appeal to working class voters in pursuit of their votes. The conservatives were first, and did so mainly only in response to the Vatican, and did so somewhat half-heartedly, until they realized that their efforts helped them to win elections in urban districts. The Liberal Democrats, having lost the Civil War of 1891, appealed to workers in the country's nitrate north in an effort to reconstitute some of their lost political power. For both parties, winning elections was about more than advancing a particular ideological vision of the country's future. They understood that access to state patronage was at stake, and they talked about it. After constructing a database of legislative elections through 1918, I've been able to document the shifts in the party system of coalitions through the period and have connected electoral outcomes to party positions on the class question in Chile. Specifically, I found that after the conservatives and the liberal Democrats started to build up a base of working class support, other parties started to follow their examples whenever these parties suffered a severe political defeat or saw that they were about to suffer a severe political defeat. So, for example, Chile's Radical Party finally wrote workers into their party platform just ahead of the 1906 congressional elections. Most historians of Chile wrongly think this was the first time a political party wrote workers, a mainstream political party wrote workers into their platform. But actually, the radicals will relate to the scene. Their alliance partners, the liberals, did the same thing in 1907 in their first party convention after the 1906 election, in which both parties suffered devastating losses. In terms of the middle class, my special interest, the conservatives were the first to actually raise this group as a particular object of concern, and they did so after the 1912 election, when the party survived a serious electoral scare, but saw its coalition support in urban districts suffer a serious decline. And it was in this first politicization of the middle class that Chilean elites actually defined the meaning of the term in the particular and peculiar way that Friedrich later found so puzzling. But what is especially remarkable in all of these cases is that while party leaders used electoral reverses to write working class and middle class voters into their programs and strategies, they also made clear that the true stakes at play were the patronage opportunities that were made possible by nitrate rents, and patronage opportunities that were in turn made possible by winning elections. I've also found that each party also contained critics that opposed the various moves that were made to appeal to working class and middle class support. Regardless of the party, these critics voiced doubts that workers, especially blue-collar workers, would feel at home in what were essentially elite parties. Some of these critics doubted that such workers would even allow themselves to be taken in by what seemed to be obviously cynical ploys on the part of the parties to attract popular sector support. But this is where the institutional arrangements trumped ideological purity. Despite what these critics would decry, the attempts to turn erstwhile elite organizations into mass political parties, they might decry the attempt to convert these parties. The electoral and fiscal system created in the aftermath of the Civil War assured that parties would need to increasingly seek the support of urban workers. As a resolution to the elite struggles that led to a political breakdown in 1891, politicians devised a system whereby all the parties with strong representation in Congress would have some claim on distribution of patronage. And since most major parties had some rural districts where they could be assured of representation, the decisive elections were in urban districts where all the parties had the ability to win at least one of the multiple seats typically available. Party politics thus came to focus increasingly on winning these swing seats by appealing to the interests of the urban residents that lived in these constituencies. And over the period from 1891 to 1918, these interests were increasingly seen by the parties to be those of workers, as politicians understood them. And one by one, all the parties wrote workers into their party programs as a gesture both to themselves and these workers that they wanted their votes. After tracing out the evolution of elite politics on the worker question, it is clear to me that Chile's union movement had a more complicated relationship to politics than is typically depicted. In the case of the white-collar workers in particular, I now think that the storyline is almost diametrically opposed to the standard account of a heroic struggle against the politically entrenched bourgeoisie, and almost diametrically opposed to what I wrote in my dissertation. When I line up the timelines of party politics and union history, I now see that almost every conjuncture the unions took their cue from the oligarchic politicians rather than vice versa. For example, the first real groups of white-collar activists appeared in 1903 in support of conservative party calls for the Sunday rest law. 10 years later, in 1913, the first groups to call themselves white-collar unions appeared just after the Conservative Party convention of that year called for such unions, and just before the Liberal Party convention tried to jump on the same bandwagon. In addition, these unions described the plight of white-collar workers and equated white-collar workers to the middle class in almost exactly the same terms used originally by conservative politicians in their 1913 convention. On the basis of this pattern, I think it is fair to conclude that party competition inspired Chile's political class to practically invent a middle-class union movement where none had previously existed. Here, at least, the political economy of a semi-democratic rentier state directed the historical motor of class conflict. Over time, this competition for working-class votes had a long-term impact because the politicians institutionalized some of the peculiar pro-worker policies that they embraced. Ideas that came from them and not from the workers themselves. I do not want to imply that Chile's oligarchic parties deserve credit for actually acting to improve the living conditions of workers. In point of fact, Chile's politicians passed very little in the way of effective social legislation before 1924. And when they did so in 1924, it was because a military coup forced them to do so. In this respect, the politicians only deserve credit for authoring a series of ambitious, contradictory proposals that would form the basis of a confusing and poorly designed set of enduring legal institutions. This institutionalization of pro-worker policies became important because it structured Chile's system of class relations. In particular, it gave a separate set of benefits, rights, and obligations to employers, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, and to the separate organizations that represented these individuals before the state. These institutions were supposed to mirror the perceived division of society into three separate and definable classes, upper, middle, and lower, but these institutions actually helped shape the way Chileans lived and thought about class. I go on a little further, but to sum up, in this particular case, the relevant history started further back than I had originally imagined, but pretty much exactly within the political economy that John said I needed to study. The political economy of the rentier state before 1920 and not after 1920. And it turns out that the men with the guns and the men with the money mattered quite a bit in shaping the institutions that underlay Chile's 20th century class relations. These historical actors were not fighting over a plot of Chihuahuan land, but in the Chile of 1910, a hiring letter for a steady patronage job would have been the symbolic equivalent of Villa's handful of dirt.
Thank you very much. We're only running 20 minutes behind, so we have 40 minutes for discussion before breaking for coffee. I see some hands up already. Paul Gutenberg.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so the way I heard this panel, it's that it's the closest panel that we're going to have to one about economic history or maybe better put, historical political economy. So that kind of to rephrase some of the broader questions that came up yesterday, I kind of want to know how people are thinking in terms of what's going on in the field of economic history, possibilities for revival, new foundations for historical political economy. Let me just back up a little bit to sort of add fuel to answer. Now, I have to confess myself that for the past 20 years or so, I've always described myself as a recovering economic historian, which, like being a recovering Catholic or alcoholic, I guess is a lifelong struggle. And sort of the embrace of commodity history, which I noticed that a number of people here are also, is a wishy-washy solution to that, where you're always in some kind of liminal zone between materialism and non-materialism. Now, John, in our years here, was far less wishy-washy. He had a very particular passion, I think of it as a brilliant passion, which was to develop a kind of scientific, empirical, quantifiable form of economic history, but at the same time, and this is what I think was quite unique about John, it's hard to think of other examples, one that was politically, socially, and morally engaged at the same time. And though John was alone in this, I think that he was drawing at the time from really this clash of what we would now call meta-narratives that was going on at that time. You know, big questions about capitalism, big questions about underdevelopment, big questions about the nature of modernization, and all the schools that went along with that, okay, which it was a particular political conjuncture, really, the 60s through the 80s, which we are no longer living in, or are we? So I'm not sure how much more context I want to give to this type of discussion, but now for a variety of reasons, it seems to me that there seems to be a demand again for economic history. And I'm wondering what people are making of this. Even the New York Times a couple of weeks ago had this article about the rise in kind of academic courses on capitalism, which is interesting in itself, that the word capitalism, or the concept of capitalism, sort of went underground in academic circles. I think modernity replaced capitalism for 20 or 30 years. And so I'm wondering what you're thinking about this, the reemergence of the demand and what the kind of response is going to be. I have my own ideas about it, because the other context that seems to have shifted so dramatically since the 60s and the 70s and the 80s are the economies of Latin America and where they stand in a global scale and where they stand in relationship to the United States. I think a few decades ago, no, when Cardoso was president, he made this tremendously insightful statement, or maybe self-justificatory statement about Brazil. He said, Brazil is no longer an underdeveloped country, it is an unjust country. And there's such a strong ring of truth to that with respect to so many countries of Latin America today, that even Peru now is considered to be an intermediate developed country, no longer an underdeveloped country. So how does that frame the questions, inequality versus underdevelopment? And the fact that we could look at the United States and say almost the same type of, that the distance between us and them as economies and the economic relationships between the United States and the developed world and Latin America has shifted so dramatically. How is that framing the new questions that are going to be asked in economic history? So I guess I sound almost like a Trotskyist in going on with this non-question, but I'd like to know whether you think that this is real, this idea of the possible revival of economic history, and what directions do you think this is going to take?
Well, a couple of things came to mind while Eric was talking yesterday about John's comments about Mallon's presentation or paper many years ago. The one that stands out to me is, it was a few years ago, John had this article on, it might have been in the Latin American Research Review, and there was a commentary there on Engerman and Sokolov's factor endowment, and it was he sort of pitched it, as I recall, as sort of the factor endowment approach versus the institutional approach. And I thought that was a pretty savage takedown. Very elegant, by the way. But brief and accurate. And I do think that there is one of the benefits that I see now in terms of, I don't read a lot of economic history, but there does seem to be a debate on that side among, economic historians. And it seems to me that the institutionalists are winning. And I see it as an optimistic view, because you can do stuff about institutions. You can't do a lot about, endowments. And I think that generally does coincide with an optimistic moment in the economic history of the region. Like you said, I think that the past 10 years may have been terrible here, but they've been really good overall for Latin America. So that's what I see.
I have to, let me just take the exactly opposite tack and remind us that Latin American economies are growing based on on simple extractivism. To this day, Chile is a primary and one of the biggest primary goods exporters. Grapes and mining materials. So one of the interesting things that if you approach this from an environmental historian's perspective is you look at the incredible. Sure, there's a boom. Go look at the 19th century mining techniques being used in Colombia to mine coal and open air coking furnaces. It's unbelievable. So certainly there's a boom, but I think another way of looking at it is it's a boom because China is hungry, because India is hungry, and increasingly it's true Brazil is hungry, but Brazil remains a primary source.
I want to follow your question, because I have the feeling that you didn't answer. That is how is going to be economic history today. What is the new things that is going to are about economic history? Because I have the feeling the same, that at least in Peru, economic history is in bankrupt. Before historians, they ask them, what do you think about economic policy, about the government, etc. Today, historians never talk about economics, or very little, and I have the feeling that the field is broken, I read the New York Times also article, and I was very enthusiastic. And Douglas North, it works, it doesn't work, because if I remember well his book of institutions, there is one part that they talk about culture, how culture shape economics, but there is no insights how to deal with that, you know.
Jeremy,
Can I?
Well, I wasn't there, but
Oh, well, I'd like to jump in and suggest, Paul, that your question, the automatic connection of history of capitalism and economic history is the problem. That I'm not going to wait to say what economic history is, but history of capitalism, it is not just about economics. And if you look at the historians now who are doing a history of capitalism, it's cultural, so it's not just about, I see economic history, rightly or wrongly, as a sort of methodology, and that can be applied to any other field. And a history of capitalism, I mean, some people do businesses, some people do commodity flows, some people do sort of cultural flows of things in terms of capitalism, but I wouldn't link the two.
I just also want to point out that it's not that new, right? My first elective course when I got here was The Emergence of Capitalism with Bill Sewell.
Oh, no,
So-
it's a revival.
Well, I don't think it really went away. I mean, but you know, I think people were teaching it. Now it's suddenly very popular.
Nils Jacobson.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I had specific questions to several of the very, very interesting presentations, but Paul's opening, the general question is really central, I think, and it was very good. And so I understand Deborah's intervention, but I think that the distance between what Paul is asking and what Deborah suggests is precisely the problem at which we are at this moment. And that is, I'm giving a class right now on sort of the required class for our graduate students called History and Social Theory. And so, you know, I was trying to push it a little bit in terms of sort of more quantitative things and doing something with Amartya Sen and then on social network theory. And they realized that stuff on material culture and so forth, they're interested in economic things, but they are not willing to invest in the methods of the social sciences. They still see themselves as humanists. And so we're at a moment where economic questions are becoming very, very interesting, but many of our departments and many of our faculty are not equipped to teach people in economic history, and the students at this moment are not willing to invest in that kind of stuff. So in terms of where is it going, I mean, conceptually, I don't know, Paul. I'm not satisfied with Pablo's answer in terms of institutional stuff. I mean, if you look at Acemoglu, and I forgot the other guy's name. Robinson. I mean, for Latin Americans, it's devastating, right? And right in the first chapter, the way he deals about the difference between north of the border and south of the border is awful. Is outright awful. And so, I mean, there may be. I mean, I know that John comes out of that corner of the world, but obviously there are very refined and very interesting ways of introducing the institutions. But institutions alone are not the answer, and I suspect that perhaps a bridge, particularly a bridge between what Paul is saying and what Deborah is saying, might be political economy, sort of linking economic stuff with power stuff. I think there's interesting things going on right now, but we're still in a quandary, I think, in terms of reviving a serious economic history that has broader appeal.
I so totally agree with the complexity of that question. And also this answer that institutionalism seems, I know why you mention institutionalism in that sense, that it's more contingent and there's more human agency in it, but there's the critique of institutionalism, and I have a feeling, although John is being silent in this debate so far, that he'd actually agree with this, is that institutionalism in odd ways, and there was a brilliant article by that guy who used to teach here, Jaworski, about institutionalism a few years back, that institutionalism is oftentimes just a big black box that doesn't tell you, it's in some ways analogous to what used to be called, the stages of modernization. That it's replaced modernization theory as sort of this big, oh, well, we know something is going on here, but we don't know exactly what it is. Does it serve any real analytical value? And so it's still marking off these large areas of economic life that we don't understand how they work historically. But I think that that your answer is correct. There's a growing demand, but we don't have a response. And yet Chicago was one of the few places that had the possibilities because of the scholarship that was produced here. It's interdisciplinary, real interdisciplinary force to do that.
Chuck Walker?
Yeah, I was just going to chime in to 2 points on this debate. First is, it is very clear to me, and I think a lot of what we're saying is the interest among students about economic history, about economics. I mean, undergrads, there's an interest in understanding. I always tell my students in sort of large classes, the area that I find the largest divergence in knowledge and understanding is economics. I mean, I can sort of get an idea of who's read books before, novels, if I name drop economics, some of the students who are activists, anti-free trade, they literally don't understand supply and demand. John will be shocked to think I'm the one to teach them, but anyway. And in graduate students, there is this thirst for structural studies. I mean, there's this sort of weariness of post-structuralism, and they want to address large debates. And this is just a general phenomenon that really pretty superficial New York Times article dealt with. But I want to be specific about one of the points you made, back to Chris. One of the things that I sort of dabble in environmental history, and I teach it, and a lot of our students do, and a lot of my colleagues I work with. Environmental history made a very smart turn about 10 or 15 years ago, forcing people to learn the science. And that's what everyone says. I mean, if you're a glaciologist and you can't understand, you can't go to a scientific conference with numbers, with jargon. I mean, you're really not going to do as well. And this is now it's happening with economics. I mean, beyond the sort of reaction of, well, extractive economics are bad and it's not going to really lead to development if Peru has been growing at a 7% rate. And good environmental historians are really learning about local impacts, multiple ways to understand economics, and broader macroeconomics. I think it's very, very welcome. So, and those of us who sort of dabbled in this here can pat ourselves in the back, or at least thank John.
Tenorio?
I think very interested in this question as well, and I must maybe do a mea culpa first, in the sense that we cultural historians are to be blamed for many excesses that happened in the last decade. And I don't know if you realize, after this boom of Chicago, in which you were trained in good economic history and good political economy, we were in an empty space in which economic history was attacked for both fronts. One, friendly fire by very good economic historians who became very ideological and very strong geometrics who moved to economics departments, and then make it even more outrageous and easy for cultural historians to criticize that kind of history. And the other, the excesses and the stupidities that for the last 2 decades we have seen in cultural history. I've been worried a lot about this because I think that the damage is structural, because we have not trained scholars, students. We have, after the demise of Chicago, trained one generation or two who are the main stream of Latin Americanism in the US, training very cheap cultural history, extremely simple arguments. And you can blame my friend Steve Haber for whatever you want, but basically Steve Haber is totally marginal in the field. There's nothing that, while the other guys really command the system. And the problem is that I have seen in my years trying to train people and trying to involve them in more. I cannot train in economic history, but I tell me, what you want to do history of science, you have to learn the science you are going to deal with. You want to do history of economic thought, I want you to know economics. I want you to quantify, I want you to do something. I've been now involved in helping some people, a Mexican colleague, about getting people to do some, with Moramay Lopez Alonso, about measuring height of soldiers. Really, as we saw yesterday and we were talking about today, I mean, the topic is inequality. Let's find a way. I mean, we all know the topic. So how, it's not about, you know, poor countries. These are very wealthy countries. It's about inequality. And these methods, but the problem is our students and many of history my age, historians my age and younger generations who are now located in American, Latin Americanism are handicapped by 2 decades of training in very pure cultural, ideological history, which is showing its results in very poor students that we have educated and I don't know you realize how much the sort of beautiful bubble that you have here with Professor Katz and Coatsworth here for many years, how damaged it was for the field when we lost it. Of course, you could say, well, you are here now, you should do it. You know, it's a big burden for me to try to do, or for Emilio, or for Brody, for them to try to do it. I mean, we try our best, but think about it. I mean, you know, I'm sorry, but for a cultural historian to have to read all these manuscripts and to be considered part of a guild that has this kind of very bad cultural history, which cannot even face Acemoglu with the same language that Acemoglu talks. Okay, you want? I don't agree with Acemoglu's view of Latin America, but I cannot come as an economic historian and say, here is why, in little ideas, not big things. You know, this is the research, and I show you how this is wrong. I cannot do it. If I start doing culturally, he immediately can say, you know, you're one of those. Because we are one of those.
I guess I'll just say some anecdotal things. I've sort of come from the disadvantage of being, not disadvantage, I'm very happy there, being at a liberal arts college where I don't have grad students and I'm not training anyone. So I can't really comment the way some of you can about how, I guess Pablo's in the same, about how students respond. Undergraduates are just a whole different story. But there's a question that economic history disappeared for 20 years. I mean, I am an economic historian, and interestingly, for my first 2 decades, and I always talked about this with Eric, sort of frustrations, because I felt like I had no one interested in what I was interested in, and the people who were tended to be older. I don't know if it's, and I'm a colonialist too, so some of the questions of the 20th century, just a little bit different addressing directly. I don't know. I think there is some new economic historians in colonial who are coming out. It's more new, it's more recent, but in the last 5, 8, 10 years, there have been a small number. I don't think it's any, although when I think about them, I guess they're kind of John's last students from Harvard, maybe. So really, you have to, John, you have to have, John, you got to come out of you got to go back to teaching, and if you want to resurrect economic history. Obviously, I don't think it ever became irrelevant or unimportant. It just became something people weren't focusing on.
Can I just briefly say that I also think that there is a link between environmental history and economic history, and some of them work better than others. The one that works, I think, perhaps best talks about production and processes of production and conditions of production, and those can actually tell us quite a bit. They can marry social history, economic history, business history, which is actually sort of what I briefly presented today, if you want to put it that way, and resource history. There's a terrible blindside, I think, spot for environmental history, and that's when it attempts to take a step back and look at questions of endowments, because it becomes some sort of super mega structuralism in which if you have gold, that's all you need to know. the country doesn't matter. I can, this is what's going to, which of course, when environmental historians do that, it's this very impoverished sort of caricatured history. It can become a very impoverished and caricatured history. And so that's actually where I think, when we look at some of the failures of that emerging trend, which by the way is, I think, an emerging trend. I think our students are also quite interested in those questions as well. But that's a real failure.
Can I also just throw out the idea that I don't think one has to be deeply, deeply trained in economics to do economic history. I think that there's an awful lot of history that we would see and recognize as economic history that has nothing to do with econometric models. It's just simply a way of thinking and a way of asking questions that need not be, as I think Mauricio was suggesting, that students simply don't want to, that the learning curve to do economic history is so great. I don't think it needs to be, frankly. I think when it gets too technical, I think it sometimes it ceases to be history, and it ceases to be what makes historians, which is
but there is a kind
deeply
of
archival.
Repertoire of questions that as is coming about. How can you tell the students, identity is not a category of historical analysis?
Well,
How could you convince them that, get out of this, and there are things that cannot be known in the past. And when you tell them that and you say, I don't agree with Asimov, I hate all this, I think it's very simplistic. They are not theoretically educated to contradict whatever they say. They don't really understand what they are saying.
You assign economic history to students.
Well, I assign history to economic thought. And I would like for them to know a little bit if they're going to talk about science, I tell you, go learn the science. If you are going to study music, I want you to be able to know music. I cannot. And if you are going to criticize Asimov, I want to speak that language before you come and talk to. I don't.
Milokuri?
Fascinating. I just thought maybe it would help also to make us feel better to historicize the moment. There is no going back. And I think that there are these internal arguments about our training graduate students and what they do and what they don't and what happened to economic history here and more generally in the profession. But I don't know if they mirror, that would be too simplistic, but they're connected to larger external forces. Yesterday we talked about why many of you came to do Latin American history at all, and why did you do it here, and the historical context. Well, that changed after that, right? In the 90s, there was no Central America, there was no rallying anything, there was no political movement of that sort. How that is connected to this, I don't know, but there is some connection. Why students do Latin American history now, why cultural history of that sort. What I would say is that, one of the challenges we face now is not just what Mauricio is saying, which is very real in terms of training students, but also the ways in which the world out there, you get jobs doing El Salvador and doing all these places. It's a different situation now. Where is that, and what is that about, right? So in a way, the idea of Latin America in academia, what was interesting about Latin America, why you would want to have a Latin Americanism, that changed too, for external reasons and internal ones. And so part of the difficulty, we all along actually, I should say, have continued to train students here in some fashion of political economy in the sort of heterodox way in which Chicago had always done it. But what we found is that, shall we say, the academic market's appetite for that also changed. And we were not as successful in competing for the best jobs as you guys were when you were competing for those jobs in the 70s and 80s, where you didn't have to explain why some work on agrarian issues in El Salvador was important and the university wanted to have it. Try doing that now, and try training a student to do that now and go to get a job. And and to compete with students who are doing, I'm not going to characterize it, other things that out there have become more identified, either meaning in other universities and colleges with, if I'm going to have 1 or 2 Latin Americans, what do I want? Somebody who does what you do, or did back then, or somebody who does, you name it, And so, I think what we're seeing now is that trend itself is also beginning to change. That is to say that, and we need to be prepared, to take advantage of that. That is, I don't know, and I don't know that I could characterize exactly in what way it's changing, but we're seeing signs, and I think this discussion is about the science that is changing. The idea of what's interesting about Latin America in American universities, what conversations is Latin America a part of? And what I would say to conclude is that maybe we can take a more active role in shaping that. Certainly it would help your students, those of you who have students, and our students here, but also that maybe in preparation for that, if it's moving, and I hope it is moving in the direction of taking economic matters broadly understood much more seriously as part of what we do, that perhaps we ought to think seriously about how we make up for that deficit in training that we've had in the last couple of decades. There are these summer institutes for social sciences for historians. Some of our students are now beginning to go to those, and they were completely uninteresting to our students some years ago. You couldn't even get them to think about doing that. But maybe, I'm just going to throw this out, but maybe, we could think about, some kind of workshop series or something where we actually help interested, promising graduate students in various universities in Latin American history to engage themselves early on in their careers with some of this economic methodology. Again, not necessarily, as you were suggesting, in a particularly technical or hardcore way, but to sort of introduce them to what they can do if they become, as Mauricio is suggesting, literate in this kind of work. At a time also when it may be more appealing to them, precisely because there is this historical shift where all of a sudden questions of economy and inequality are becoming important, and where Latin America somewhere is fitting in that in a way that it was not in the 90s, and where Latin America meant other things that you all know about. So maybe it's that we could think about that in that way.
The only thing I want to add is, in a sense, we're very much, being like this, we're very much like Jeremy's traders and Katz, because our cycles are so slow. It's almost better to go contrarian. I remember all of us were doing rural history, and I had a friend at another university, Mauricio, who did the middle class in Lima. And no one would pay me attention to, that's dull. We wanted, the revolting peasants and this and that. By the time you're done, it's in the book, it's a 10-year cycle. It had turned around. So it's sort of like when, I was going to ask you.
I'll let them know.
Katz merchants, they found out, there's too much X there. Then they say, okay, let's ship more because I'll be in the second cycle of, there will be a demand by then for it.
Yeah, tell them they won't get a job unless they understand supply and demand. Maybe they'll start studying it.
Burley Fisher?
It strikes me that I was thinking a little bit last night about some of the things that I really love about this generation of work that is represented here. And it's not really so much that I think of it as a generation of economic history. It's that when I look around the room and I think about books that I love and that I use teaching all the time, there are very few of them that didn't use the kinds of insights that you would get from economic history in making an analysis of whatever it is that they're interested in. And so if Eric's going to talk about music in Mexico, he's going to think about the record industry. And no one's going to think about political movements without thinking about land and materiality. And there's just an element of being willing to be eclectic and being willing to use any kind of tool that is at someone's disposal to try to understand a problem. And I think that in some ways, actually, that may be what was lost more than economic history per se, is that sort of sense that if you're trying to solve a historical problem, you're foolish to exclude any kind of tool that's going to give you access to it, and you ought to go out and learn how to use those tools if the data is in front of you so that you can bring it together with everything else. And I think, having studied with John in another context, that's one of the things that was most illuminating, is just this idea that these are things that you can use, and go out and figure out how to do a regression if you think that's going to be useful to you. And maybe you'll do it badly, and maybe you'll learn you don't want to do it again, but you'll get something from it, right, as you go through. And I think that that's something that's completely doable as a kind of generation of people who are educating new students. And maybe that ought to be what we're grasping at in terms of integrating all of these different ways of seeing the world.
Could I just comment to Brody? I see what you're saying, Brody, but I think if you look at this generational cohort, and it's a pretty broad generational cohort, it covers nearly 20 years, 15 to 18 years of finishing the PhD here, but most of the people here were in a situation in which they already knew that the cultural turn was sort of speeding up, and so they were taking the insights from Friedrich and John, sort of, that would be driving them to political economy and class stuff and all those kinds of things. But they also knew that there were a lot of other things. So Michel says, I learned a lot from Leo Auslander. It was very, very important. So they had to take that in. clearly there. Otherwise, they would have placed themselves outside of the market. So in that sense, this eclecticism it was part of this generational
It
experience.
was a moment in the social sciences that was unique. And that moment in social sciences corresponded with the global moment of the end of the Cold War, which was unique. I mean, there was a conjuncture there.
And I think that you guys were lucky. You guys were lucky to have Friedrich and John, that they were so tolerant of allowing you to go that way.
Tolerant, that's the word. Tolerant.
That, you know, they
But they were steadfast too. In a sense, you know, they were they stood for something that was a sort of foundations of the social sciences against which we could kind of bounce things off.
But I'm sorry to jump in. I don't see it as tolerant. One of that's not what I meant. I don't see it as tolerant. Or I wouldn't use that word, I guess. It ties back to what we were talking about yesterday, and this notion of interdisciplinarity. I didn't see it as sort of a push toward interdisciplinarity. I see it as not disciplining the disciplines, which both in my case and I think everybody else here, enabled both John and Friedrich to push us to answer sort of in any way that was at our disposal, sort of picking up what you said, Brody, to answer the questions that we found compelling. And so not disciplining the disciplines was the discipline essentially, or the methodology that would allow us to, you know, pull things and push beyond what they had, the framework that they had laid out. Now, personally, I didn't see myself as doing anything they did until I was revising the dissertation into a book, and I go, oh my God, John and Friedrich are all over this thing, because I didn't recognize it. And my position here was about sort of, you know, parent to child, defining myself against them. But I too do political economy, and in this case, the commodity flow are the laborers, right? So I don't know. I just, yeah. Well, I guess I'll leave it at that. But
Let's give the last word to Paul Gutenberg, and then we'll close the session.
I don't know if this is a summary, but I do have to say that this is one of the most interesting and deepest discussions I've heard of this question of the present state of political economy perspectives I've heard in a long time. I heard a lot of very wise responses. And I met the question in an optimistic sense. I'm optimistic. I think this is a really interesting moment for the return of historical political economy. This is just really an odd anecdote, but some editor at Duke University Press, which has sort of made its name in the business of cultural history, told me, in an aside, the best-selling book that they've had in the past 10 years was actually the Topic collection on from silver to cocaine. Yeah, and that's the best-selling, and they want more books like that. So just to give you some idea about, maybe we passed that cycle, but what I heard a lot of very interesting insights here, like what Chuck said about environmental history. Environmental history in many ways is the way in which most of our students, a lot of our students go into environmental history, are returning to kind of material forces, structural forces, and they're doing it in an extremely contingent way. And they're doing it in a critical way, as you brought up, that extractivism is should be at one of the centers of the debate about the current growth model in the Americas. A commodity history, there hasn't been much talk about this, but this connectedness in the global and material and cultural life of commodities is a pretty hot topic among students and a few professors as well. The history of inequality and the history of class, I think, has come back in a really big way. And John himself has been writing a great deal about inequality whenever he gets any time away from the office. And I do think that there's going to be a continuing debate, a growing debate about institutions and capitalism. And I think that, so I'm not pessimistic about it, though I do recognize exactly what Mauricio. And I also wanted to say that what Neil said is interesting. There's a sort of a demand for more soft and qualitative social science these days. Students want to know, what Weber had to say about the economy. They want to know about network theory. They want to know about these things, though I do agree that there's a kind of an allergy to going too deep into learning sort of the technical details of how to do social science history. But they want to know the broad ideas. There's a thirst for putting things back together in a kind of a holistic way. So I'm actually kind of optimistic about this moment, despite the fact that what Mauricio said is also very true, that there's this tremendous disjuncture and lost ability to train students in this area. But I do think that there'll be, it's like patches that you get for your software. I think that we'll be able to make patches and shortcuts to be able to get back to where, recover what was best from the past.
So we need a nap.
We need
No. We need to do what my business school students at the Wharton School once told me they would do once they were hired. I said, "You're coming from spreadsheet class. Is that what you like to do?" And they said, "No, we'll never do that after we get work. There'll be a gearhead to do it for us." And so let's remember collaborative research seriously as one option for dealing with technical matters. Let me close the panel with great thanks to the panelists. And